Hello, my lovelies. Granny Shivers here, and tonight I've got a spine-tingling story just for you. It's about a young man who returns home to New Zealand after years of wandering abroad, only to find himself heading down a road you should never travel. But before we unravel this eerie tale, make sure you've subscribed to my channel and click that bell, because if you adore spooky, the chilling and the utterly mysterious, you won't want to miss a thing. So whether you're settling in with a warm drink, tucked under a blanket, or simply bracing yourself for the unknown, let's dive into what happened on a trip like no other. The road you should never travel. The More Pork's warning. I've been travelling for years over in Europe, 5 to be exact. The old streets of Prague, the rolling hills of Tuscany, and the dark trees of the Black Forest. They all call to me in their own way. But after all that time, I found myself yearning for something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was from exhaustion from living out of a backpack, or the realisation that I have become a ghost to my own roots. So I came back to New Zealand, my homeland. I thought being here might help me find what I'd lost, my connection to the land, my people, maybe even to myself. But the city was too much. The noise, the crowds, the restless pace, it grated on me like sandpaper. After a few weeks in the city, I'd had enough. I packed up my gear, slung my guitar over my shoulder, and set out for a place I've remembered only from childhood whispers. It was a hidden paradise, one of those corners of the country that barely anyone knew about, and those who did rarely spoke of it. Maybe it was because they wanted to keep it unspoiled, or maybe there was another reason. I caught a bus heading out of the city, riding for hours as the landscape changed from sprawling urban chaos to serene countryside. The sun dipped low, casting the hills in a golden haze. When we reached the last stop, a small, sleepy town where the bus driver gave me a look that lingered way too long, I shouldered my bag and began to walk. The air was cooler here, tinged with the earthly scent of damp ferns and pines. I followed a winding road out of town and eventually veered off into the bush, guided by my instincts more than a plan. It was dusk by the time I found a small clearing amongst the trees, just big enough to pitch my tent and make a small campfire. New Zealand is one of those rare places where you don't have to worry about predators. No snakes slithering in the dark, no bears sniffing around your campsite. At most, you might encounter a wild boar or a curious stag, but they generally keep to themselves. I set up camp quickly, a well-practiced motion calming my restless mind. The stars began to peek through the canopy above, bright and sharp against a velvet sky. There was no pollution here, no hum of distant highways, only the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a cricket. I sat outside my tent with my guitar, strumming aimless tunes as the world seemed to fall away. The music felt different here, resonating with the stillness, blending with the whispering trees. The warmth of the night coaxed me to lay my sleeping bag under the stars. The sky seemed impossibly vast, and for a moment I felt like I could stretch my hands out and touch the cosmos. Sleep came easily, but it didn't last. I awoke with a start, heart pounding, unsure of what had disturbed me. The night was still and heavy, the kind of silence that felt deliberate. Then I heard it. The high-pitched, piercing yelp of a morepork, or a ruru as the Māori call it. It's a small, unassuming owl, but its cry carried an edge that cut through the stillness. Local tradition says the morepork is a guardian, a bridge to the spirit world. Its call is usually seen as a good omen, but that sharp, sudden yelp, that's something entirely different. It's an ominous warning. The sound repeated, closer each time. It echoed through the trees, reverberating in my chest. My spine tingled and my heart beat hard in my chest. The air felt different now, thicker, colder. The stars, so vibrant earlier, seemed to retreat behind a shroud. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a bird, just a sound, but the unease settled deep, coiling in my gut. I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag over me as if it would shield me from the unseen. The calls continued, sporadic and disjointed like a language I couldn't understand. Sleep eluded me. I stared at the canopy above, watching shadows shift and twist until they no longer seemed like shadows at all. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I felt like I had aged years in a single night. The ruru had gone silent, but its warning lingered, etched into the stillness. Something had changed, though I couldn't yet name it. As I packed up my camp and kicked dirt over the embers of the fire, the forest watched, its silence heavier than before. I should have turned back then, but instead I pressed on deeper into the unknown. The two backed men. Continuing my journey deeper into the unknown, I stuck out my thumb to hitch a ride. Despite my unease at the bus driver's lingering interest and the eerie Moorport call from the previous night, I told myself it was safe enough. Hitchhiking in this region of New Zealand was common, and us Kiwis have an unwritten rule: you help someone in need, especially out in the sticks. After a few long, lonely stretches of road, an old man pulled up in a battered station wagon, his face lined with years, his eyes sharp. He offered me a ride, but made it clear it came with strings. A lecture about the dangers of hitchhiking. "World's not safe as it used to be," he said, glancing at me with one eye as he kept the other on the winding road. I nodded politely, half listening, but honestly I was just grateful for the lift. The countryside rolled by in a blur of green hills and distant mountains. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since the day before. After 40 minutes or so, we passed through a teeny town, little more than a petrol station and a corner store. He stopped and told me, "This is where you get out." Rather surprised at the sudden stop, I thanked him and climbed out, hoisting my bag and guitar from the car. He called after me, "Be careful, lad. Not everything out here is what it seems." If I'd known how true those words were, I would never have embarked on this journey. The sun was high and the town was eerily quiet. A stray dog, a scruffy mutt with mismatched eyes, trotted up to me, wagging its tail. I bent to pat her and she leaned into me warm and solid. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement by the corner store. It was an unassuming building, weathered by time, with a barn or a warehouse attached to the back. Something about it gave me the creeps, but hunger won out. The dog followed me as I approached the shop. Pushing the creaky door open, I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with a couple of aisles stocked with the usual stuff: chips, biscuits, fizzy drinks, and a sad selection of fruit that had seen better days. My stomach churned at the thought of junk food, so I decided to look around for something more appetizing. Towards the back, I noticed a heavy set of curtains, striped in dark blue and black. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled the curtains aside and gasped in astonishment. Behind them was a massive, brightly lit supermarket. Rows upon rows of gleaming shelves stretched far beyond which should have been physically possible for a building this size. Workers in crisp uniforms bustled about, restocking shelves, items, and straightening displays. "What the hell?" I muttered, stepping over the threshold. The dog trotted in beside me, her nails clicking softly on the polished floor. The air smelled of fresh bread and ripe fruit. My stomach growled louder. Grabbing a small trolley, I began wandering the aisles, overwhelmed by the sheer abundance. Fresh produce gleamed under perfect lighting, and there was an entire road dedicated to cheeses. Every kind of food I'd ever craved seemed to be here. 15 minutes later, my trolley was loaded with supplies, but as I turned to head to the checkout, a prickling unease crept over me. I realised I hadn't seen a single cashier. The workers, who were everywhere just moments ago, now seemed to flit away whenever I got close. I tried calling out, but no one responded. Their movements became stranger, always at the far end of an aisle, disappearing around the corners as I approached. Frustrated, I abandoned my trolley and sprinted towards a tall, lanky worker stocking shelves. "Hey," I called, my voice echoing unnaturally. He didn't turn. Closing the distance between us, I tapped him on the shoulder. He spun around, and I stumbled back with a gasp. He had two backs. Where his face should have been was another back of his head, identical to the one I'd seen first. His head twisted, contorting grotesquely, as if trying to see me. The dog growled low at my side, her hackles raised. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. The worker tilted his head in an unnatural bird-like motion. He then began moving towards me, both backs flexing as if breathing. Panic took over. I grabbed the dog's collar and ran, dodging around shelves and slipping on the polished floor. Behind me, I heard the rhythmic shuffle of footsteps, too many feet to belong to just one person. The bright supermarket lights flickered and the air grew colder with every step. As I reached the curtain, I yanked it aside and stumbled back into the dim, musty corner store. The dog bolted past me, barking wildly. The curtain swung shut, and when I turned back, there was nothing behind them, just a blank wall. My breath came in ragged gasps as I clutched at a shelf for support. Whatever that place was, I knew one thing for sure: I'd walked into something I didn't understand, and it wasn't done with me yet. Whispers in the woods. Terror gripped my heart as I bolted through the shop, yanking the door open. I tore out into the street, not even looking back. Bright sunlight hit my face, but I didn't even take it in as my feet pounded the asphalt as I sprinted up the road. The painted white marks disappeared behind me, and the road narrowed, eventually turning into little more than a track. The trees closed in on either side, their twisted branches reaching out like emaciated fingers. Shadows grew darker and seemed to lengthen as if they were alive, creeping closer with each step I took. The air was thick and heavy, pressing against my lungs. An eerie noise began to rise, like a distant rustling that turned into whispers. They came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, a buzz of murmurs just beyond the edge of understanding. The forest appeared alive, breathing and pulsating as the whispers grew louder, taking on a distinctly human sound. My name! They were whispering my name over and over again. Sam, Sam. Panic clawed at my throat. I screamed, trying to drown out the voices, and pushed myself harder, shoving through the overgrown underbrush. The path was barely visible now, obscured by creeping vines and tangled roots. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I stumbled forward, the whispers ringing in my ears like a sinister chant. Then I tripped. My foot caught on a root, and I fell flat on my face, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Gasping for air, I lay there for a moment, eyes squeezed shut, hands pressed against my ears in a desperate attempt to block out the voices. My heart hammered in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to get up and run, but my body wouldn't move. Suddenly a wet, slobbery sensation slid across my face. I screamed and scrambled backwards, swatting blindly at whatever had touched me. My eyes flew open, and to my immense relief, it was the dog from the shop. She stood there, tail wagging, tongue lolling out in a doggy grin, as if she hadn't just scared me half to death. I let out a shaky laugh and reached for her, grabbing her collar and pulling her close. I buried my face in her warm, slightly musky fur, letting her steady presence ground me. The whispers had stopped, just like that. The oppressive noise vanished, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I lifted my head curiously and looked around, my heart still racing. To my shock, I saw what appeared to be my campsite from the previous night, but something was wrong. It was different. The fire pit had nothing but a pile of cold ashes, the stones scattered as if by some forceful hand. Everything I had stowed in my pack earlier that day was there. My tent, which was shredded, its tattered remains fluttering weakly in a non-existent breeze. Pieces of my clothing and camping gear were strewn across the ground, half buried in the dirt and leaves. Everything looked as though it had been abandoned for years, not just a few hours. I scrambled to my feet, the dog sticking close by my side. Slowly I moved through the ruins of the campsite, picking up items one by one. My shirt torn and filthy, my guitar case charred and blackened, and the once smooth leather cracked and brittle to the touch. My sleeping bag reduced to little more than scraps of fabric. My head spun. This was my stuff, there was no doubt about that. But how could it be in this state? My mind reeled, gasping for some kind of logical explanation, but none came. The dog sniffed around the campfire, her ears perked up and tail stiff. She pawed at the ashes, uncovering something small and dark. I knelt down and picked it up carefully. It was my notebook, my diary, or at least it looked like it. The cover was scorched, the edges brittle and curled from heat. I wiped the grime off and flipped it open. My breath caught in my throat. The pages weren't filled with my neat, careful handwriting. Instead, the writing was scrawled and jagged, barely legible sentences. The man who stops for you? Pay in blood? The end is near? Pay in blood? The words repeated over and over, growing more frantic as they filled the pages. The ink looked smeared as if written in a hurry or in desperation. My hands trembled as I dropped the notebook, my heart thundering in my chest. A shiver of pure terror ran down my spine. I couldn't stay here. Whatever was happening, whatever this place was, I had to get out. "Come on, girl," I whispered hoarsely, grabbing the dog's collar. She looked up at me with those intelligent eyes, her tail wagging slightly as if to reassure me. Together we turned and fled the clearing, leaving the burnt remnants of my life behind. The Mirror Lake. When was this nightmare going to end? My legs ached and my throat burnt from running. I slowed my pace, forcing myself to breathe deeply and steady my racing heart. "Something has to make sense," I muttered to the dog trotting by my side. "This is crazy. I'm in New Zealand, my homeland. Things like this don't happen here." The dog, her ears moving with every sound, stayed glued to my side. Her presence was my only anchor in this unravelling world. I glanced down at her and whispered, "Am I losing my mind?" She looked up at me, her mismatched eyes filled with calm understanding that made me feel just a little less alone. For a while the path seemed normal. The eerie whispers had vanished, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and a gentle breeze. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, painting dappled patterns on the ground. The dog's tail wagged as she sniffed at the air, and I almost dared to hope that the nightmare was over. Then we came to a lake. The water was perfectly still, a sheet of glass reflecting the sky, the clouds, and the trees around it. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. I stopped near the edge and crouched down, leaning closer to the surface to see my reflection. But it wasn't there. The dog's reflection was there, her form clear and sharp in the mirror-like water, but I was missing. The trees, the sky, and even a passing bird were reflected back perfectly, but not me. My stomach churned as fear clawed its way up my throat. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was some kind of trick, and leaned forward again. Still no me. I stumbled back. my breath coming in shallow gasps. "What is this place?" I whispered. Dropping to the ground, I lay on my back and stared up at the canopy. The dog sat beside me, her warm body a comforting weight against my arm. "At least you're real," I told her, reaching over to stroke her fur. She nuzzled my hand in response. Suddenly a sound drifted through the still air. Music! The soft, sweet notes of a flute floated towards us, growing clearer with each passing second. I sat up, scanning the area. Across the lake a figure emerged from the trees. She was beautiful, almost unearthly. Dressed in flowing white, with long dark hair cascading down her back, she moved as though she was gliding rather than walking. Her flute in her hands gleamed in the sunlight as she played, the melody haunting and wistful. The dog growled low in her throat and tried to back away, but I held her collar tightly. The woman stopped a few feet from me and lowered the flute. Her dark eyes seemed to pierce right through me as she smiled faintly. It wasn't a comforting smile, it was sad, almost apologetic. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Where are we? What's happening to me?" She didn't answer. Instead, she spoke softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Make peace before the last note fades." I strained to hear her words, my mind spinning with confusion. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" But she had already raised the flute to her lips again. The mournful melody resumed, wrapping around me like a shroud. The dog whimpered and pressed closer to my side, her body trembling. I watched frozen as the woman began to move. She floated gracefully around the clearing, her feet barely touching the ground. Her song filled the air, weaving a spell that made the world seem distant and unreal. I blinked and she was gone. The music ceased abruptly, leaving an achy silence in its wake. The flute lay on the grass where she had stood. I hesitated, then got to my feet and approached it cautiously. It was cracked and weathered, as though it had been laying there for years. When I picked it up, it felt strangely cold, sending a chill through my fingers. I turned to look back at the lake and froze. There were paw prints in the mud at the edge of the water leading up to the lake, but none coming back out. My heart pounded as I glanced down at the dog. She was still there. Her warm, solid body pressed against my leg. But the paw prints? Nothing made sense. My mind screamed for answers, but the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I backed away from the lake, the dog following close behind. We had to keep moving. Whatever was happening, staying here wasn't an option. "Come on, girl," I whispered. Together we stepped back into the shadows of the forest, leaving the silent, empty lake behind. The road that never ends. The dog grew restless as we trudged along the trail. Her ears twitched, her nose constantly in the air, sniffing at unseen things. Every so often she would pause, staring into the dense undergrowth with her tail stiff and her body tense. Then, without warning, she darted into the trees, vanishing into the shadows. "Doggo!" I shouted after her, my voice echoing eerily in the stillness. Panic clawed at my chest. I was torn between running after her and staying on the trail. My gut told me to stick to the path, to keep moving forward. But what if she didn't come back? What if something happened to her? The forest felt alive, pressing in on me with every second that passed. My legs trembled, exhaustion pulling at me, but fear kept me rooted. Then a rustling in the underbrush snapped my attention back, and to my immense relief the dog emerged. Her fur was damp and she carried something in her mouth. As she trotted towards me, I saw what it was, a torn piece of fabric. My breath caught in my throat. It was a strip from the shirt I was wearing. My eyes darted down, and sure enough, a jagged tear marred the fabric on my side. I touched it gingerly, my fingers brushing the frayed edges. But how? When? The impossibility of it gnawed at me, sending a cold wave of dread through my body. "Where did you find this?" I whispered to the dog, as if she could answer. Her tail wagged slightly, but her eyes seemed worried. Before I could dwell on it any further, the trail abruptly ended. My feet hit asphalt, and I stopped dead. The road stretched out before me, its surface cracked and uneven, flanked by the same oppressive trees. The dog whined softly, nudging my leg as if urging me forward. The light was fading fast now, the sky painted in hues of deep orange and purple. Shadows crept across the road, lengthening and twisting like grasping fingers. My body screamed for rest. My legs were leaden, my throat dry, and my head pounding. But the sight ahead forced me to keep moving. Lights, teeny twinkling lights dotted the horizon, beckoning me like a distant promise of safety. Relief surged through me, and I quickened my pace, each step bringing me closer. But with every step, a sinking feeling gnawed in my guts. The lights seemed familiar, too familiar. As the buildings took shape against the darkening sky, dread pulled in my stomach. No, it couldn't be. I stopped dead in my tracks. There it was, the store, the same one I had stumbled into earlier that day. The same fluorescent lights flickered weakly above the door. The same faded open sign hung crookedly in the window. My knees threatened to give out as I stared at the building. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. No, this isn't real." But the dog tugged at her leash, pulling me forward as if to say, "It's here, it's waiting." I took a shaky step towards the store, then another. My hand trembled as I reached for the door. Before I could touch it, the lights flickered violently, casting the street in an eerie glow. A shadow moved inside the shop. Too quick to see clearly, but large enough to send ice through my veins. I stumbled back, almost tripping over the dog. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing louder. My name echoed through the trees, through the asphalt, through the air. "Sam, Sam, Sam." My hands clamped over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside me, vibrating through my skull, like a relentless chant. The dog barked sharply, her body tense and her eyes fixed on something in the distance. I followed her gaze and felt the blood drain from my face. The road behind us was gone. In its place was an endless stretch of forest, the trees so dense they formed an impassable wall. There was no way back, only forward. "This isn't happening," I muttered, my voice shaking. "This can't be happening." The whispers grew louder, overlapping, tangling together, until they were no longer words, but the noise of despair. The dog barked again, snapping me out of my spiralling thoughts. I turned to her, clutching her fur as if she was my lifeline. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, we go forward. We keep going." But as I turned back to the store, the lights went out completely, plunging the world into darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the moon, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. The door to the store creaked open, revealing nothing but a black void within. A cold wind swept past me, carrying with it a voice that was unmistakably my own. "Come inside, Sam. You've been here before." My legs locked in place, every instinct screaming at me to run, but where could I go? There was no escape. The dog pressed against me, her body trembling, her low growl a constant vibration against my leg. "Stay with me, girl," I whispered, gripping her collar tightly. Together we stepped towards the door, the darkness inside beckoning like hungry jaws. This was the road that never ended, and I had no choice but to walk it. The end of the road. The moment I crossed the threshold of the store, the world shifted. The dog hesitated, her body trembling violently as if she too felt the unnatural pull of this place. The door slammed behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the door wasn't there anymore, just a blank wall, cold and unyielding under my palm. The lights flickered, revealing shelves lined with rotting produce and rusted cans. A smell hit me foul and sickly, like decay, and something far worse. The air seemed to hum with an unseen energy vibrating just at the edge of my perception. The dog growled low in her throat, her ears pinned back. "It's okay, girl," I whispered, though my voice was anything but steady. I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, her or myself. Then I saw him, the old man. He stood at the counter, his back to me, his silhouette unnaturally still. I felt my stomach twist as memories came flooding back. The car ride, his sharp, glinting eyes in the rear-view mirror, and then the knife. My hands flew to my stomach as if expecting to find blood, but there was nothing. No pain, no wound, just a lingering phantom ache. "You remember now, don't you?" the old man said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. He turned to face me, and his eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction. "It took you long enough." "What is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "What's happening to me?" "You're dead, Sam," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not possible." He laughed, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, it's very possible. You didn't think you could survive what I did to you." Images flashed in my mind, my hand gripping the knife, the blade plunging into my stomach. The hot rush of blood spilled out as I gasped for air. I staggered back, my knees threatening to give out. "But why?" I asked, my voice barely audible. His expression darkened. "Why does it matter? You're here now, and here is all there is." The dog barked, a sharp, piercing sound that broke the suffocating silence. She lunged at the old man, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he raised her hand, and the dog froze mid-leap, her body suspended in the air as if held by an invisible string. "No," I shouted, trying to rush towards her, but I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the floor, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. "This is your eternity, Sam," the old man said, stepping closer. "Trapped in the moment of your death, reliving the road, the forest, the lake, over and over again." His words sent a cold wave of terror through me. "There has to be a way out," I pleaded. "There has to be something I can do." The old man tilted his head, considering me with mock pity. "There's only one way out," he said. "You have to make peace with what happened. Accept your death. Only then can you move on." The dog whimpered, her body still suspended in mid-air, her eyes pleading. "Let her go," I said through gritted teeth. "She doesn't belong here." The old man smirked. "She's your tether, Sam. She's been guiding you, trying to help you see the truth. But she can't save you. Only you can do that." I looked at the dog, her loyal eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She had stayed with me through everything, her presence the only thing grounding me in this twisted reality. Closing my eyes, I took a deep breath. Memories of my life flooded back. Playing my guitar on the streets of Europe, laughing with my friends, the simple joy of a morning sunrise, and then the memory of the knife, the pain, and the old man's cruel smile. "I'm dead," I whispered. The words tasted bitter on my tongue. "I'm dead." The moment I said it, the room began to shift. The walls melted away, replaced by a blinding white light. The dog dropped to the ground, landing softly on her paws. She padded over to me, her tail wagging gently. The old man's form began to dissolve, his face contorting in rage. "You think it's over," he snarled. "You think you've won?" But his voice faded, swallowed by the light. I knelt down, wrapping my arms around the dog. "Thank you," I whispered to her. She licked my face, her warmth filling me with a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. As the light grew brighter, I felt the weight of limbo lift. The whispers stopped, the road vanished, and for the first time I felt truly free. When the light finally consumed me, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. And just like that, the road that never ended came to an end.